A Navy officer spit on a Royal Guard's boots and then shoved him in front of a crowd in uniform on British soil. He thought the guard wouldn't move because protocol said he couldn't. But 7 minutes later, that same officer's security clearance was revoked, and he was told to his face he'd never set foot near the palace again. Want to know how it went from mockery to institutional exile? First hit that subscribe button and tell us where in the world you're watching from. Now let's get into it. The late morning sky over Buckingham Palace had that particular London quality grey enough to make the red tunics look deeper, bright enough to catch every brass button and polished buckle. Tourists moved in their usual rhythm behind the ceremonial ropes, phones up, voices dropping to respectful whispers when they got close to the guards. Lance Corporal Rhys Evely stood at his post like he'd been carved from the same stone as the palace itself, 37 years old, six sworn shoulders that had carried a Bergen pack through 3 tours in Afghanistan with 45 Commando Royal Marines. His bearskin hat added another foot to his height, but it was the stillness that made him seem larger than life, the kind of stillness that comes from watching dawn break over hostile territory, knowing that movement means death. Most tourists saw the red tunic, the ceremonial rifle, the perfect military bearing. They didn't see the thin scar along his left temple from shrapnel in Helmand Province, or the way his right hand gripped the rifle just a fraction tighter than regulation required. Muscle memory from firefights where that weapon had been the difference between coming home and not. The crowd that morning was the usual mix: a Japanese family with matching cameras, German tourists debating quietly in their precise English, American college students trying to get the perfect selfie, everyone following the unspoken rules: admire from a distance, don't cross the ropes, show respect for the tradition. Then came the loud American voice that cut through the morning calm like a rusty knife. Jesus Christ, would you look at this circus? Commander Gareth Mercer stepped to the front of the crowd like he owned the sidewalk. Early 50s U.S. Navy dress uniform that looked like it had been pressed an hour ago. Aviator sunglasses perched on his nose despite the overcast sky. His white service cap was tucked under his arm, and he chewed gum with the aggressive jaw movement of someone used to being the most important person in every room. Behind him trailed 2 younger embassy aides who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else on Earth. One kept glancing nervously at his watch. The other had that haunted expression of someone who'd seen his boss embarrass America before and knew he was about to watch it happen again. This is what they call elite military, Mercer said, loud enough for half the plaza to hear. A department store mannequin in a Halloween costume. A few nervous chuckles rippled through the crowd, the kind that happens when someone's being inappropriate but you're not sure if you're allowed to object. A middle-aged woman from Ohio turned slightly toward him. Sir, maybe we should keep our voices down. This seems like a working. Mercer barked out a laugh. Lady, the only thing this guy's working is his ability to stand still and look pretty for the cameras. He stepped closer to the rope barrier, his government ID badge swinging from a blue lanyard that screamed federal authority. The kind of credentials that usually made people step aside and let him do whatever he wanted. Reed didn't move, didn't blink. His eyes remained fixed on that invisible point ahead that guards are trained to focus on, a spot somewhere beyond the crowd, beyond the street, beyond everything that might tempt them to break formation. But if you knew what to look for, you could see the subtle signs: the way his jaw had tightened almost imperceptibly, the slight adjustment in his grip on the rifle. These weren't signs of weakness. They were signs of a professional calculating just how much he could endure before duty required a different response. One of the mod stewards standing nearby, a thin man in his 40s with the kind of mustache that belonged in a 1940s war film, reached for his radio. His thumb hovered over the call button, but he didn't press it. Mercer had the right badges, the right clearances. Being obnoxious wasn't technically a crime on palace grounds. Back in my day, Mercer continued, his voice carrying that particular American confidence that assumes everyone wants to hear his opinion. We trained soldiers to fight, not pose for postcards. This is what happens when your military becomes a tourist attraction. He pulled out his phone and started recording, narrating like he was David Attenborough discovering a new species. Here we have the British Palace Guard in its natural habitat. Notice how it remains completely motionless even when confronted with reality. Scientists believe this is a defense mechanism developed to avoid actual military service. The crowd was shifting now. Uncomfortable glances exchanged between families. A young father picked up his daughter and moved back a few steps. This wasn't the respectful tourist experience they'd come for, but Mercer was just getting warmed up. I bet this guy hasn't seen a day of real combat in his life, he said, circling around to get a better angle with his phone. Probably went straight from basic training to standing around in fancy dress. No mud under those fingernails, no sand in his boots. Just another pretty boy playing dress-up for the tourists. A 10-year-old boy tugged on his father's sleeve. Dad, why is that man being mean to the soldier? His father hushed him quietly, but the question hung in the air like smoke from a snuffed candle. The mod steward finally pressed his radio button. Control, this is Post 7. We have a possible diplomatic situation developing at the main barrier. American official is testing boundaries with the ceremonial guard. The response crackled back through his earpiece. Copy post 7. Monitor and report. Do not engage unless Crown property is directly threatened. Mercer caught the radio chatter and grinned. Oh, are they calling for backup? What's next? Calling in the SAS because someone asked your statue a question. He stepped closer to the rope, close enough that his breath would have fogged the brass on Reese's uniform if the guard had been facing him. Come on, soldier boy. Give us a reaction. Blink, twitch, something to prove you're not actually dead. Standing up. Still nothing from Mari. But now a thin line of sweat had appeared at his hairline, just visible beneath the rim of his bearskin hat, not from the temperature, from the effort of maintaining control when every instinct trained into him by years of combat was screaming for action. Mercer reached into his pocket and pulled out a handful of change, British coins, probably left over from buying coffee that morning. He held them up for the crowd to see. Let's test the reflexes on this museum piece. The first coin landed with a sharp ping against the stone near Reese's left boot. The guard didn't move. Nothing must be switched off. The second coin hit closer, actually striking the toe of Reese's polished boot before rolling away. Still nothing. Ladies and gentlemen, I think we've found the world's most expensive scarecrow. More phones came up. People were recording now, though whether to capture Mercer's performance or document his behavior wasn't clear. The embarrassment was starting to radiate outward. Other Americans in the crowd looked mortified. Tourists from other countries whispered among themselves. One of Mercer's embassy aides finally found his voice. Sir, perhaps we should move on to the next stop on the tour. Shut up, Patterson. Mercer snapped, without looking back. This is educational. These people need to see what their tax money is paying for. He flicked another coin harder this time. It struck Reese squarely in the shin and clattered to the ground. The silence that followed wasn't the respectful quiet of tourists anymore. It was the kind of silence that comes right before something breaks. But Ree didn't break. He stood there, like a mountain, immovable, eternal, carved from something harder than stone. And that's when Mercer decided to escalate. You know what, he said, his voice taking on that dangerous edge that men get when they mistake silence for weakness. I think this whole thing is fake. I think he's not even a real soldier. Probably some actor they hired to stand around and look impressive. He reached into his jacket and pulled out his phone again, this time switching to video mode. This is Commander Gareth Mercer, U.S. Navy, currently observing what the British. What you're about to see will demonstrate exactly why America leads the free world. The mod steward spoke into his radio again, more urgently this time. Control, escalation likely. The subject is preparing for some kind of demonstration. Copy, riot response on standby. But Mercer wasn't waiting for permission. He ducked under the rope barrier like it was a minor inconvenience, not a boundary that had been respected by millions of visitors before him. The crowd gasped. Someone shouted, "Sir, you can't." But Mercer was already across, standing just 3 feet from Ree, close enough to see the individual stitches in his red tunic. Now let's see if there's actually a human being under all this pageantry, he said, still recording himself. He walked slowly around Ree like a buyer inspecting a used car. The guard didn't track him with his eyes, didn't acknowledge his presence in any way, but the crowd could see what Mercer couldn't: the way Reese's breathing had become more controlled, more deliberate, the way his stance had shifted almost imperceptibly, weight balanced for movement rather than mere display. Up close, it's even more ridiculous. Mercer narrated to his phone. Look at this uniform, must cost more than my car. All for someone who probably couldn't fight his way out of a paper bag. He stopped directly in front of Ree, so close their faces were inches apart. I said, look at me. Nothing. I'm talking to you, toy soldier. Still nothing. That's when Mercer did the unthinkable. He hawked up a wad of saliva and spat directly onto Reese's polished left boot. The glob landed with a wet splat against the black leather, clearly visible against the mirror shine. For a moment, the entire plaza went dead silent. Even the traffic noise from the streets seemed to fade away. Then Mercer grinned and turned to his phone camera. Oops, wind caught it. He chuckled at his own joke, then reached out and placed both hands on Reese's shoulders. Let's see if this statue can be moved. With a sudden, violent shove, he pushed Reese backward. The guard stumbled, his perfect stance broken for the first time. He caught himself, regained his footing, adjusted his rifle back to position. The damage was done. The sanctity of the ceremonial space had been violated. The dignity of the uniform had been assaulted. And somewhere deep in Reese Ivley's chest, something that had been held in check by years of discipline finally snapped its chains. There we go, Mercer announced triumphantly to the crowd. Turns that he can move after all. Just needed the right motivation. He turned back toward his phone, preparing to deliver some kind of closing statement to his impromptu documentary. He never got the chance. Removed not the mechanical movement of the ceremony, but the fluid, predatory motion of a Royal Marine who'd spent years hunting enemies through Afghan. The moment he was standing at attention, the next, his gloved hand had closed around Mercer's tie at the knot, yanking the commander forward off balance. Mercer's eyes went wide as he felt himself being dragged down. He tried to speak, tried to protest, but Reese's other hand had already found its target. The knee came up fast and hard, driving into Mercer's solar plexus with the precision of someone who'd been trained to incapacitate enemies quickly and quietly. All the air rushed out of the commander's lungs in a single agonized wheeze, but Ree wasn't done. With movements so smooth they looked choreographed, he spun Mercer around and slammed him chest first against the ceremonial rope barrier. The commander's arms were pinned awkwardly behind him, his face pressed against the brass fixtures, his expensive sunglasses skittering across the stone. "You spit on the uniform," Ree said, his voice low and deadly calm. Each word was precisely enunciated, carrying the kind of quiet authority that makes hardened soldiers stop what they're doing and listen. "You'll never wear one again." He held Mercer there for exactly 3 seconds, long enough to make his point, not long enough to be called excessive. Then, with the same controlled precision, he released the commander and stepped back. Mercer collapsed sideways onto the gravel like a discarded puppet, gasping, humiliated. His perfectly pressed uniform now wrinkled and stained with his own sweat and spittle. Ree returned to his position. His bearskin hat had shifted slightly in the scuffle, and there was a small scuff on his left glove, but otherwise he looked exactly as he had before, oceanless, professional, unshakable. Except now, everyone in that plaza understood something they hadn't before. The stillness wasn't weakness. It was restraint. And restraint, once broken, reveals exactly what it's been holding back. The silence that followed was deafening. Phones hung motionless in hands that had forgotten they were recording. Children pressed closer to their parents. Even the pigeons seemed to sense that something fundamental had shifted in the ancient space. Then came the sound of boots on gravel, multiple pairs, moving fast. Mode security hit the scene like a coordinated strike force. They appeared from multiple directions simultaneously through the palace gates, around the corner of the Queen's Lifeguard building, even from positions in the crowd that no one had realized were occupied. Men and women in black tactical gear, moving with the kind of efficiency that only comes from years of training and clear chains of command. Captain Fiona Harland led the response-mid-40s, compact, with a kind of presence that made people automatically straighten their posture when she approached. Her uniform was immaculate, her movements precise, and her eyes missed nothing as she surveyed the scene. "Stand back," she commanded, her voice carrying easily across the plaza. Civilians remained behind the barriers. The crowd obeyed instantly, parents pulling children closer, tourists stepping back with the universal recognition that they were now witnessing something far beyond their usual London sightseeing experience. Captain Harland's gaze swept over Mercer, still struggling to get his breath back on the gravel, then to Ree, standing at perfect attention as if nothing had happened. "Guard," she said sharply. Reese's eyes moved to her the first time. He'd broken his forward gaze since the incident began. Step back from the scene. One precise step backward, no more, no less. Harland turned her attention to Mercer, who was finally managing to push himself up to his knees, his face red with effort and humiliation. "Are you injured?" she asked, her tone carrying all the warmth of a medical examiner. Mercer struggled to his feet, brushing gravel from his uniform with shaking hands. "I was assaulted," he wheezed. "That maniac in the costume attacked me. This is assault on a federal officer." Captain Harland's expression didn't change. "Commander Gareth Mercer," she said, consulting a tablet that had appeared in her hands. "You crossed a restricted ceremonial boundary, made physical contact with a serving member of the Queen's Guard, and engaged in what our witnesses describe as deliberate provocation, including spitting on Crown property." "I was testing his discipline," Mercer protested. "It's a legitimate training assessment." "You have no authority to conduct training assessments on British soil," Harland replied calmly, "and certainly no authority to spit on Her Majesty's uniform." The crowd had gone completely quiet now. Even the usual London traffic noise seemed muted, as if the city itself was holding its breath to see how this would play out. One of Harland's officers approached with a body camera and whispered something in her ear. She nodded once, then looked back at Mercer. "The entire incident has been recorded from multiple angles," she said, "including your statements about conducting unauthorized training assessments on foreign military personnel." Mercer's face went pale. For the first time since stepping over that rope, he seemed to realize that his actions might have consequences beyond his control. "Now wait just a minute," he said, his voice taking on a desperate edge. "I have diplomatic status. I'm here as part of a NATO liaison program. You can't just. Diplomatic status doesn't grant immunity for criminal behavior." Harland cut him off. "An assault on ceremonial guards is specifically excluded from diplomatic protections under the 1961 Vienna Convention." She made a subtle gesture with 2 fingers. "Detain him." 2 mod officers moved forward with a kind of professional calm that spoke of years of experience handling situations exactly like this. Mercer tried to back away, but there was nowhere to go. He was surrounded by security personnel, witnessed by dozens of tourists and caught on camera from every angle. "This is a mistake," he shouted as the handcuffs clicked into place. "I'm a commander in the United States Navy. You can't do this to me." We just did, Harlan replied simply. As Mercer was led away, still protesting his innocence and demanding to speak to someone in charge, Captain, Harlan turned her attention back to Ari. The guard had remained perfectly still throughout the entire arrest, showing no reaction to Mercer's struggles or protests. "Guard," she said again, her voice softer now. Reese's eyes met hers. "Are you fit to continue your post?" For a moment something flickered in Reese's expression, not weakness, but perhaps the acknowledgement of what he'd just done, the choice he'd made between protocol and dignity, the line he'd crossed and could never uncross. Then his jaw tightened slightly, and when he spoke, his voice was steady as granite. "Yes, ma'am." Harlan nodded once. "Very good, carry on." But as she walked away, she was already reaching for her radio. Because what had just happened wasn't going to end with Mercer's arrest. There would be phone calls to make, reports to file, and consequences to deliver that would reach far beyond the gravel plaza of Buckingham Palace. The black Land Rover that pulled up to the palace gates 7 minutes later bore no markings except for a small crest on the door that most people wouldn't recognize. But Captain Harlan recognized it immediately, and the sight of it made her stand just a little straighter. The driver who emerged wore civilian clothes, but he moved with the unmistakable bearing of someone used to giving orders that were never questioned. He approached Harlan with a manila folder tucked under his arm and spoke in the kind of crisp upper-class accent that could open doors in Whitehall or close them forever. "Captain, I trust the situation has been contained." "Yes, sir." "The subject is in custody. Full documentation is complete." The man nodded and opened his folder, scanning the contents with the rapid eye movements of someone speed-reading through legal documents. "Commander Mercer's security clearance has been reviewed," he said without looking up. "His access credentials have been revoked at the highest levels. NATO liaison status terminated. His posting to the embassy has been discontinued." He closed the folder with a crisp snap. "As of this moment, he no longer exists in any system that matters." Captain Harlan felt a small smile tug at the corner of her mouth. "Understood, sir." Meanwhile, in the holding area beneath the palace, Mercer was discovering exactly what it meant to fall from grace in the British system. His phone calls weren't going through. His embassy contacts weren't returning messages. Even his own aide, Patterson, had somehow become unavailable. The duty of Asura, sergeant with 20 years of experience dealing with difficult prisoners, explained it to him with a kind of patient professionalism usually reserved for explaining things to children. "Your credentials have been flagged, sir. You're no longer recognized as having official status. That makes you a civilian who assaulted a British soldier on Crown property." "But I'm a U.S. Navy commander," Mercer protested for the dozenth time. Were the sergeant corrected? Past tense. "According to our records, your commission was revoked approximately 6 minutes ago." The words hit Mercer like a physical blow. 23 years of service, a pension he'd been counting on, a career that had defined his entire adult life, all gone because he'd wanted to prove a point to a guard who'd never asked for his opinion. Back on the plaza, life had returned to something approaching normal. Another guard had taken Reese's position, a younger man with the same perfect posture and unwavering focus. Tourists were taking pictures again, though with a newfound respect for the ropes and barriers that separated them from the men in red tunics. But Reese Evely wasn't among them anymore. He'd been quietly rotated off duty for debriefing, medical assessment, and what the military euphemistically called administrative review. He walked in through the palace corridors with the same measured pace he'd maintained at his post. But now his mind was processing what had just happened. He'd broken protocol, laid hands on a foreign dignitary, crossed a line that thousands of guards before him had managed to avoid crossing. And yet, as he thought about the weight of Mercer's spit on his boot, the feel of unwanted hands on his shoulders, the violation of everything his uniform represented, he couldn't bring himself to regret it. Some things were more important than protocol. Some insults demanded an answer, and sometimes the price of maintaining perfect discipline was losing the very thing that discipline was meant to protect. By evening, the story was already spreading through military circles, though the official reports would be classified for decades. A video taken by one of the tourists had begun circulating online, though the palace's media team was working to contain its spread. The headlines, when they eventually appeared in carefully selected publications, would be diplomatic in their language but clear in their meaning. U.S. naval officer recalled following diplomatic incident. Security breach at Buckingham Palace results in detention. NATO liaison program suspended pending review. But the real story, the human story of a man who'd stood silent under provocation until silence became complicity. That story would live on in different ways. In the respectful distance tourists now maintained from the ceremonial guards, in the quiet pride of soldiers who served beside men like Reese Evely, in the understanding that some uniforms represent something larger than the people who wear them. 3 days later, Lance Corporal Ree Evely received a message requesting his presence at a small ceremony in one of the palace's private rooms. No press, no fanfare, just a handful of senior officers and a brief conversation about duty, restraint, and the moment when restraint becomes its own form of failure. He was not court-martialed. He was not disciplined. Instead, He was quietly commended for maintaining the dignity of the crown under extraordinary circumstances and responding to assault with appropriate and measured force. The commendation would never appear in his public record, his name would never be in the papers. But his action that day had sent a message that rippled through diplomatic channels from London to Washington and back again. Disrespect the uniform at your own peril. Commander Gareth Mercer, meanwhile, found himself on a commercial flight back to the United States, his military career in ruins, his pension revoked, his future uncertain. He would spend the rest of his life trying to explain to anyone who would listen how a simple misunderstanding had cost him everything. But deep down, in the parts of himself he tried not to examine too closely, he knew it. It hadn't been a misunderstanding at all. It had been a choice, a series of choices, each one leading inevitably to the next until he'd found himself spitting on a symbol he'd never bothered to understand, and the God, the man he dismissed as a mannequin, a statue, a toy soldier playing dress-up, had taught him the difference between power and authority, between making noise and making a point, between demanding respect and earning it so completely that even your enemies have no choice but to acknowledge it. The last thing Mercer saw as his plane lifted off from Heathrow was the London skyline and modern buildings standing side by side, symbols of a tradition that had outlasted empires and would outlast him too. Somewhere down there, he knew, guards in red tunics were standing their silent vigil, protecting something larger than themselves with a discipline he'd never understood and would never possess. So here's the question we're left with. When someone tries to humiliate you in public, what's the stronger response, fighting back or refusing to break? And in our age of instant reactions and social media responses, is there still power in choosing silence over spectacle? What would you have done in Reese's place? Would you have maintained discipline? Or would you have responded the way he did? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. We read every single one, and these conversations matter more than you might think. If this story made you think differently about strength and dignity, if it showed you something about what real authority looks like, hit that like button. It genuinely helps more than you know. Subscribe and tap that notification bell so you never miss our daily stories about the remarkable men and women who guard these ancient traditions. And if you know someone who could use a reminder about what genuine strength looks like, someone who thinks power means making the most noise until people pay attention, share this video with them. Your next Royal Guard story is waiting on your screen right now. Click it and we'll see you tomorrow with another moment that proves the same truth over and over again. Real strength doesn't announce itself, it simply stands, and when it does, even the loudest voices in the world discover they have nothing left to say.